January 26, 2023 meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. This meeting is being recorded and will be available after its conclusion via a link on the Commission's website. I'm going to join the others and welcome one of our new commissioners, Chris Tudor, to this committee, and also join in welcoming Mike Carter to the commission as a whole. You guys are going to be welcomed a lot, and we're very glad you're both here. I also would like to join in the welcome to our guests from the State Charter Schools Commission of Georgia. We look forward to interacting with you, and we see you there, and welcome. Wish we could have brought you better weather. Just as a reminder, please hit your microphone light before speaking. And with that, Dragine, could you please take a roll call of the committee?
Commissioner Richards?
Here.
Commissioner Tudor?
Here.
Commissioner Griscom?
Here.
We have 3 of 3 commissioners present. We have quorum.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take a minute and talk about our agenda. We will consider 6 items. First, Melanie Harrell and Maggie Lund will provide the committee with LEA school and operational updates. Next, we'll have an update from Kelly Croneman on the FY24 IDEA allocation methodology. After that presentation, we'll hear an update from Beth Figueroa on the 21-22 annual report and monitoring update. Then Maggie Lund will provide a presentation on the renewal process, followed by an update on the revisions made to the Commission's school performance framework. You all will remember we've been through this several times, and today it's here for final approval after a tremendous amount of work on the part of the staff. And then finally, Beth will provide a presentation on the Rutherford Collegiate Prep petition. Do any commissioners have any questions or comments on this agenda before we vote to approve the agenda? Seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
I will second.
Okay, we have a motion that has been approved, made, and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Nope. Okay, we're going to keep going. All right, next matter of business is the approval of minutes from the October 17th meeting. These were provided in our packets. Before we start, does anyone have any edits or comments to those prior minutes?
I'll move the approval.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, we'll move forward. Next, our first item is a presentation that will provide the committee an update on the Commission's role as a local school district. I'd like to recognize Melanie Harrell and Maggie Lund to provide these updates.
Thank you, Commissioner Richards. I'll go ahead and jump in, so if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Back in November, Commission staff and Commissioner Richards visited Cornerstone Prep Denver and Libertas School of Memphis, which had transitioned from the Achievement School District to the Commission earlier in the year. It was a really great time and really wonderful to kind of see our schools in action. We got to participate in student discussions and learn about the Montessori method. We also were welcomed with a very fun celebration at Cornerstone Prep Denver, where students were cheering and celebrating their transition to the commission. And we also toured one of our New Start schools, Cornerstone Prep School, which is serving kindergarten, and got to walk through their facilities and see the little kids. So it was a really great time. Fun was had by all, and I appreciate you, Commissioner Richards, for being in attendance. Next slide, please. Now for some pre-opening updates. We are now entering our pre-opening cycle for the next school year with the following schools: KIPP Antioch High School, Tennessee Nature Academy, and Rutherford Collegiate Prep. We're also completing a facility pre-opening process for the new NCP facility. Each school has had their initial pre-opening kickoff meeting with staff, and we'll continue to touch base with each school monthly throughout the pre-opening process. I just want to note that our pre-opening process is thorough, and we work really closely with our schools throughout the process to ensure a successful opening. And as an update, Tennessee Nature Academy submitted an updated budget and staffing personnel plans as a response to the request from commissioners from the October meeting, in which they were approved. There's still some concerns related to short-term and long-term financial stability within their budget, and commission staff are continuing to work closely with Tennessee Nature Academy to ensure they are operating with sound financial and operational plans, and to ensure a successful opening in August. TNA has secured a temporary facility in which they will locate for up to 3 years while they begin construction on their long-term facility, and they have already secured the land for that facility. Rutherford Collegiate Prep has secured a potential short-term facility at a local church in which they will open for next year. Beth Figueroa will be providing more information on that coming up in this meeting. Next slide, please. So to talk about Bluff City High School for a moment, they are currently on probationary status as a result of a plan of correction from their interim review that was completed last year. Commission staff visited Bluff City High School back in November in person, and we were able to walk the halls and observe classes. I'm excited to report a marked improvement from our last site visit in our observations of calm hallways and students being attentive and participating in class. Some other strengths to note as we've been monitoring them through this plan of correction process is that their 9th and 10th grade students are approaching median growth, and the school is on track to meet their mission-specific goal within the school performance framework. This is based on internal assessment data that's been completed so far throughout the school year. We've also seen improvement on Tier 3 movement of students, which are students with the highest level of intervention. And additionally, there's been enrollment gains in comparison to last year, and enrollment has remained relatively stable over the course of the year. They are currently on track to meet their yearly enrollment goals. And then finally, Bluff City has also seen lower suspension rates than last year, and more students in their Tier 2 and Tier 3 behavioral supports are receiving services, and 15 students have been exited from social work services. So there's some noted strengths as we've been going through this monitoring process with them, but I do want to note some continued challenges for Bluff City High School. Staffing continues to be a challenge to find the right teachers for the right positions. Proficiency in ELA also continues to be a challenge, as they are not trending to meet standard within the comparative performance section of our framework based on benchmark assessments that they're taking internally. That would be like an indicator of performance on TN Ready at the end of the year. Currently, 8.3% of students are on track to perform at a proficient level on TN Ready and ELA. Additionally, 4.6% of students are on track to being proficient in math. However, I do want to note that this is more in line with what we're seeing with the overall resident district in terms of percent proficient for those grade bands. So they are not necessarily off track in terms of comparative performance for that indicator. There are still going concerns with their 11th and 12th grade growth in proficiency, and chronic absenteeism is still a continued concern. While this has decreased from last year's rate, they are still over 50% of their students being chronically absent. The last thing I'll say about Bluff City is that they were placed on probationary status again after their 5-year interim review as a result of poor academic performance and being considered off track for renewal in another 5 years. However, as a result of this academic probation, Bluff City High School has also had issues with their financials, with their loan agreements going into default status as a result of their academic probationary status. Commission staff have met with Green Dot's financial team and the lender, provided information regarding the probationary status, and will continue to support to ensure Bluff City is able to continue in good standing on their loan covenants, as they're not, I want to reiterate, on financial probation. However, I do want to note that some of their financial indicators because of this status will not meet standard on our performance framework for the financial portion. Again, they're not on financial probation, but because of their academic probation, it has caused some constraints financially. Beth Figueroa will speak more about that when we discuss the annual report. You'll see that reflected there.
Madam Chair, ma'am. Yes. So what are the targets that they're trying to reach? When you look at this 4.6 and 8.3, what are the targets that are sitting out there? Because the question really is, do you all feel comfortable right now that they can move in a direction to get close to those targets?
As part of the plan of correction, we worked with Bluff City to develop multiple different targets based on proficiency, based on growth, and all of the indicators that we outlined as a reason for their plan of correction in the first place. Those targets were determined by Bluff City High School. That is something that they have created in terms of their plan of correction. And then, we reviewed those and worked with them to ensure that they were appropriate. I want to say that I know that 4.6% and 8.3 are low numbers in terms of proficiency. I think, we need to be realistic in terms of what we're going to see over the course of 1 year in terms of a plan of correction, particularly with proficiency and growth. But I do want to note that we do want to see some drastic improvements, obviously. I think the way we're approaching this is they've kind of stair-stepped this in terms of things they want to see over the course of a year versus long-term goals that they have over the next 5 years. And so, in terms of being on track or off track, those are things that we will see once we receive their TN Ready scores at the end of the year. I think that's really telling. Again, these numbers are preliminary internal assessments. I think what we're looking for is not necessarily, I don't know that we can expect all of a sudden for them to blow us out of the water and meet standard across our framework, right? But we want to see a movement even from falling far below to a does not meet. That's an improvement, right? And so I think this is something that we'll reevaluate at the conclusion of the year. Once we have our TN Ready scores for Bluff and we're able to evaluate that, we can, make a decision as to whether or not they have met those targets in a reasonable way. But I do want to note that, this is an improvement. We're seeing improvements, but we're not where we need to be yet.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Can I ask, when you talk about 52% absenteeism, that's pretty material. You have a sense in terms of one, two,
I think there's a few different reasons and things at play here. I want to note, chronic absenteeism across the board has been an issue for many schools, particularly when we're looking at a post-pandemic scenario. And we've seen chronic absenteeism particularly high across high schools in the state. So I do agree that 52% is very high and it's not something that we want to see moving forward. But I think higher chronic absenteeism rates are being seen across the board. I think for Bluff City in particular, some of the ways that they're working to mitigate this are they've hired an additional family support person who is making daily calls. They have really robust trackers to ensure that, if a student is not showing up on time, they're communicating effectively about that. This is a reduction from where we were last year. It's about almost a 15% reduction.
So thank you for the feedback. I think at the end of the day, what I'm still searching for is why. And maybe we can answer. This is post 2 years. Urban areas, for, again, challenge serve. That's I would think compared to outlier.
No.
So
Well, maybe I can help a little. The chronic absenteeism rate across the entire Memphis-Shelby County School District is very high. One of the things that I don't think anyone anticipated with high school age students is that during the pandemic, a lot of these students got themselves a job to help support their families. And they were working at a job and remote school. And then when we brought them back into in-person school, this has really put a struggle on them and their families because they were reliant on that income. So that's just an example of one reason. There's some core reasons behind this chronic absenteeism, and Memphis-Shelby County is not alone in this. The entire country is suffering from some parts of it. But it's good questions, and maybe you can spend some time with Maggie. She can go through it with you.
And so, and innocently, particularly as a new commissioner, I just, that strikes me. And so, thank you for that feedback in terms of, again, the issue of, again, youngsters needing.
Yes, sir.
I know I'm not on that committee, but just a couple of questions. Looking at these things, and I'm curious if what Chris, Chair Richardson just mentioned, the fact that you're seeing 9th and 10th grade students are getting to the median faster than the 11th and 12th, how much of that is at play? But I'd also just, I'd love to see the feeder schools going into Bluff, and where are the kids when they're coming out of those schools coming in, and what, there's just a lot of things kind of going on in my head. I'd love to see what interventions they put in place. I mean, looking at the fact that you've got more students moving out of Tier 3 intervention at a higher rate than previous, I'd love to know what they've done in those early grades that have made kind of that tremendous impact. And if that's something that they can forecast. I don't want it to look like we're saying there's nothing we can do for the 11th and 12th graders, but can they maintain that as these 9th and 10th move to 10th and 11th and 12th, while also bringing those new students up quickly as well?
I think that's a great point. I think, these are discussions that we're having in our bi-monthly meetings with Bluff City High School, and this was something that came out of our last monthly meeting was the noted gap that they were seeing with 11th and 12th grade. The last meeting that we actually had some really good internal assessment data to discuss because they had completed their benchmarks for the first kind of half of the year. And so this is where some of those trends are starting to show themselves. And so I think you bring up a good point of, clearly there are trends here that we need to be discussing. What are we doing well for 9th and 10th grade that we should be replicating for 11th and 12th? And those are discussions that we're having with their leadership team. And they are working to make some staffing changes along those same lines. That was one of the things they noted was, they did have stronger staff in certain areas where they were seeing better data and how to kind of make those shifts to ensure that all students had access. I also want to note, too, that, I think one of the things that Bluff City was really reiterating here, and you asked about feeder patterns, right? Like a lot of their students are coming in multiple grade levels behind, and I think it's important to note that here that they are trying to make tremendous growth for students who are coming in behind, and that's an important note. I also want to say, too, with that, they have an expectation to grow kids more than an annual typical amount. And so we want to see, hopefully, at the end of this year, a really high TVOS score. That would reflect that they're able to make those gains for students.
And on that, you may not be able to answer this question. So thinking about the feeder schools, what is the relationship like between Bluff City High and those feeder schools? Is it an acrimonious kind of relationship? Because I know probably most of those feeder schools are SCS schools, because if they're finding things that are working, that they could start even going to the district to implement downward so that we're seeing less of that gap coming into high school, whether it be this high school or a traditional high school. Closing the gap is all of our goals. Is that something that has started to be discussed as well?
Yes, they actually, as part of their enrollment piece as well to ensure stable enrollment, they've made quite a lot of inroads with their feeder schools. And I know their new principal has spent quite a bit of time at particularly Kirby Middle. And that's been really helpful from a collaboration standpoint. He mentioned in the previous meeting that we had that they were doing like joint professional development sessions and things. So that is something that is top of mind as well. I also have the chronic absenteeism rates here. These are for Memphis-Shelby County for 9th through 12th grade. So Commissioner Richards, to your point, their chronic absenteeism for high school in Memphis-Shelby County is currently around 31%. And then want to note for the ASD schools, 9th through 12th is 59%. And so Bluffs last year, where we ended or where we began their plan of correction and probationary status, they were at 62. So they have diminished basically 10% year over year at this point.
Would it be fair to say that your efforts and the work that's been undertaken to help them correct the situations that are have caused them to be on probation, they've been taken quite seriously and they understand the difficulty of their situation? Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. I think, We work as authorizers to uphold their school autonomy. They are very much the ones running their school, but I think this additional oversight in our bi-monthly meetings with them, they've really been transparent with us about their challenges. And at the same time, they take this very seriously and want to do what's best for kids to get their data where it needs to be.
One additional comment, Maggie had mentioned how the loan has gone into default, and that's actually hard because Bluff City is a part of Green Dot, and Green Dot has they're part of a national network, and so the default status on their loan is hurting Green Dot National. So now, in addition to having their authorizer holding them accountable, they also now have their national network, who is also saying you have to get this right because the national level is hurting as a result of the probationary status.
Okay, thank you. You want to go ahead and, are there other questions or comments before we move on?
Sorry, just one more question. I don't even know how to ask this question yet, so it's coming out raw in my head. Thinking through what, Chair Richards has said, which is the struggle of families needing additional income and the students basically needing to go to work to help with their families. Knowing, down in our chairman's county down there with Volker and Volkswagen, there's some pretty unique agreements with employers for students to both go to school and have gainful employment and stuff. Has there been any type of collaboration between Bluff City and any of the private sector that might help those students both stay in school while getting an education so that they're not having to worry about where they're going to work?
That's not something that we've talked directly with him about, so I can't provide an update on that specifically, but I think it's a great point and something we can definitely discuss with them in our next upcoming meeting.
Comments or questions? That's fine. This is, probably the thing that's keeping me up at night, because to have a school that's under our authorization to be in this serious of a situation is quite troubling, I know, to everyone. And it's, without some substantial improvement, this is not going to have a happy ending. So they know it, and they've got to work on it. Okay, you want to go on?
Great, thank you. So similar to Bluff City last year, KIPP Antioch College Prep Elementary is within its 5th year of operation, which means pursuant to statute, they'll participate in an interim review. The components of this process include the school's submission of an interim report, which we received in December, that details their progress throughout the last 5 years academically, operationally, and financially. We will also be conducting an interim site visit that will span 2 days instead of the typical 1-day site visit, and that just includes additional interviews with stakeholders, additional classroom observations, and then a performance evaluation and discussion with their leadership team, not only based on the previous year, but the last 5 years. And then we will create an interim review report that determines whether the school is on track or off track for renewal in 5 years. And we will bring forward any corrective action that may be warranted as a result of that report. We can go to the next slide. As a part of our ongoing oversight and monitoring, Commission staff visits every school within our portfolio once a year. And we have scheduled all of our site visits for the 2023 year that will take place throughout the spring. So you can see here, we are going to be on the road, and it's going to be great. We are excited as we are scaling and have many more schools entering our portfolio. We get to, this is really something that the authorizing team enjoys, really putting feet into schools and seeing it in action. It's one of the greatest experiences and my favorite parts of this job, so I'm excited to be embarking on this spring. All schools have completed their site visit kickoff meeting, and schools will be submitting documentation ahead of their site visit. That includes recent internal assessment data and a reflection on strengths and challenges over the course of the year. We create a comprehensive schedule for the visit that includes, as I mentioned, stakeholder interviews and classroom observations. We also meet with their leadership team to discuss, what's going on in their buildings and how we can continue to support them as an authorizer. And we also compile a site visit report that outlines our findings from the site visit that we provide not only to the school but also to you all as commissioners.
May I ask you a question on this? How much time in preparation are our schools having to spend to get ready for us coming in versus time that could be spent in what they're there to do? I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you're doing, but want to be sure, and I'm sure you are, that we're not putting a measure on them where they are having to take a lot of time just to prepare for us to come in versus what they really are there to do.
I appreciate that question. It is something that is top of mind for us, is to ease administrative burden for our schools. We want to be flies on the wall while we are there as much as possible, to be able to observe them and not put any additional constraints or stress on them to prepare documentation. One of the things that we do is we work really closely with our district team to ensure that we are receiving information, particularly internal assessment data and logistics and scheduling, in a way that is combining things that may also be requested from the district side, so that we're not asking for any duplicate information. And then also from that perspective as well, we do really try to limit the amount of preparation. We create the schedule for them. We do as much as we can on our end to make sure that it's as easy as possible, so that they are not feeling large disruptions to their schedules and days. And I do want to shout out, Trent has led that work for us, our authorizing coordinator, and it's a tremendous amount of work on our end to ensure that we are not putting any sort of burden on the schools as much as possible. I will now turn it over to Melanie Harrell.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So I know something that the committee had requested an update on previously is the implementation of third grade retention and remediation requirements, as well as summer bridge camps. So just to remind everybody, this is legislation that was passed in the 2021 extraordinary session, and then in the regular legislative session as well, that is meant to really address learning loss. And so the two requirements I'm really going to be focusing on today is some of the requirements that related to promotion of third graders that are not proficient on the TCAP ELA assessment to fourth grade, and then also the requirement that schools host summer bridge camps. So something that I know this committee had charged us with previously was making sure that we are working closely with our schools on their implementation of this, their communication, ensuring that they're aware of these changes that are coming up, and that they're communicating with families proactively. So something that we've done is we held a check-in with every school. We've also provided them with resources, information, but individualized check-ins to really hear from them, how things are going, what they're implementing, what the communication with parents has been like, as well as what their plans are for the summer. So in terms of other preparations for that, the sort of first option for a student who may not achieve or score proficiently on the third grade assessment is that there will be a retake opportunity for that assessment in May. So we are working with Lawrence Walker, our district testing coordinator, is working with our schools to prepare them for another testing administration that will be a new one for them. And then we're also working with our schools on identifying the tutoring and summer camp requirements that may go into effect or be an option for a student who does not reach proficiency on the TCAP test. We've also talked with our schools about how they're notifying parents, how parents are being informed. I would say we've seen some really awesome resources that our schools have put together. Libertas, for example, made a video and showed it to all parents on their parent-teacher conference days. NCP had put together some very thoughtful materials and checkpoints throughout the year. And so we also shared some of those exemplary resources across our portfolio and gave our schools an opportunity to learn from one another, where we're seeing them really thoughtfully implement these requirements. Summer bridge camps are also something that have been in effect in the past 2 years, but are taking a slightly different form this year. These are going to be critically important as they are one of the remediation options for students that may not have met proficiency but can still be promoted to the 4th grade if they attend a certain percentage of summer bridge camp days. But they do have to be authored for students in grades 4 through 8, prioritizing students that have not reached proficiency on either ELA or math for TCAP. So we have also added this to our check-ins with schools, make sure that they are planning and thinking about if they are hosting their own camp, if they want to work with a partner organization on these issues, and checking in with them on a pretty regular basis. I would say most of our schools have indicated that they are introduced around this, so we will also be monitoring if we're seeing any updates to these laws, and we.
Let's step back for a second, because I think while we're wanting to make sure kids have the core basics by 3rd grade, because that is, again, I've said this for years, our prison system in this country looks at 3rd grade reading proficiency to determine how many prison beds to have 18, 20 years in the future. So this is an extremely important metric. As we go forward, I think what would be good, and I'd rather us kind of suggest it. I don't want this to be policy, but it's something that our all of our schools need to think about is how are they really, and I mean really, tracking kindergarten, 1st, 2nd to make sure students are on track before we get to 3rd grade, because if parents have no idea what's going on, all of a sudden 3rd grade, that's where we're seeing everything compress, which is why I think you've seen a huge backlash from parents. It's where the General Assembly was trying to fix a problem. They created a bigger problem. But then in discussion within, just policy for us and things that we might want to consider, in discussing this with our superintendent back home, he's even wanting the General Assembly to give them some ability within subgroups within the district, as a district, to be able to say, all right, this segment is getting close to approaching, so we don't necessarily need to keep them back because we can do X, Y, Z, but this group we do need to probably keep back. So some things like that we can look at that might be beneficial as this goes through the General Assembly, just to kind of give some parameters that might make it better. Because again, we've been talking about this for 10 years, and our reading proficiency in this state is flatlined. It's around 36%. So we've got to do something to really change that as a whole. I just don't think what happened is the right thing right this second. So just some things that come to mind. Because again, what I don't want to see is I don't want to see the General Assembly just take everything away and we go back to the way it was, because the way it was wasn't working. This might not be working, so we might have some ideas, and our partners might have some great ideas that would be good things that we could bring forth for the Assembly to consider. That was more for Hayden.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
I will turn this back over to Maggie.
Thank you very much for these updates. As everyone can tell, this is the heart of what we're trying to help our schools deal with, and to the extent there is uncertainty in all of these areas, it makes it that much harder for them to do, what they need to do. I appreciate the work of this team in trying to provide guidance and assistance to our schools while respecting the fact that they run their schools. I have to tell you, it was a lot of fun to stand out and do the Montessori welcome. I had heard about it, but had never participated in one before. And of course, I managed to hit the day that it was about 20 degrees in Memphis. So the kids came bundled up with their parents. We had a good time, but it was a wonderful day. And I do encourage, if there's an event that's coming in your area, if you can, schools and not. It's nice to be invited and to see the celebration from those schools who are now a part of our LEA. It was really quite exciting. So with that, we'll move on. Next thing on this is to get an update on our FY24 IDEA allocation methodology. Kelly, you're on stage one.
Thank you, Chairman.
I am going to give a little bit of context since we have some new commissioners with us today. So I'm going to be providing a brief overview of this process that we've been taking to update our IDEA school allocation methodology. This would go into effect next fiscal year, but we've been taking our time this fiscal year to really investigate a meaningful system of allocating these funds that is more sensitive to student needs and engaging with our operators to make sure that they are with us and aware of these changes that we're considering and have an opportunity to provide feedback. So, with that being said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our current methodology looks like. So, for additional context, what we're talking about is our federal special education dollars that come to us through the Individuals with Disabilities Act. As Melanie had alluded to during her presentation earlier, 100% of these federal funds gets passed down to our schools. So we aren't holding on to any of these. These go directly to our schools along with our other entitlement grants. Our current methodology is pretty simple. It's just a simple per pupil allocation based on the number of students who have a current IEP at each school. And this excludes students with non-federal disabilities. These are disability categories that don't generate those federal funds. So we take the total district IDEA award that the state provides to us. We divide that by the count of students with IEPs in our district, and that creates that simple PPA, or per pupil amount. And then each school's IDEA award is determined by multiplying that per pupil amount by the number of students with IEPs in that school. This is the methodology that we are using this year to determine our school IDEA share. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the proposed methodology. I've previewed this. I want to dig in a little bit more now to make sure that you have an opportunity to provide any feedback or questions that you have. As we're proposing this update to our IDEA school allocation methodology, because we recognize that the special education and related services needed to provide each student with disability their free, appropriate public education can really vary widely from student to student. This proposed formula will better enable us to allocate these funds in a way that is better aligned to the needs of our students. This methodology would be used beginning next fiscal year. In 2020, simple per pupil allocation, it's utilizing a weighted PPA that are option codes. So these option codes are a funding mechanism that are automatically calculated in the state's special education online platform called AZIEP, type of services a student is receiving. To this data, we don't have to ask our schools from this platform. These option codes are also used in determining state funding as well. The least intensive services, the most intensive services would have an option code of 10. So their code is aligned to the proposed weights for those same option codes in the unique learning needs section formula as well. So we've intentionally designed this with that alignment, both to make it more easily usable for our schools as they're looking to shifting to the TISA formula too, but also because we know that this is what the state is looking at using for TISA. This is what they have determined as appropriate funding to match those option codes, to match those service levels. So this proposed methodology would also exclude the two non-federal disability categories that we have here in the state of Tennessee. Again, those disability categories aren't used to generate funds from the IDEA for the district share school funding allocation as well. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, we have been thoughtful in engaging our operators, making sure that we're providing them with information about what this looks like. So, we know that this update will have a direct impact on our schools and their funding. So, we provided an overview of the proposed changes to this allocation methodology during our quarterly stakeholder meeting in December. And then a proposal document that went into more detail about the actual formula and the weights associated with it was shared with operators soon after that meeting so that they had an opportunity to dig in and really get an idea of what this would look like for them based on the students they're serving. And we also shared with some other external stakeholders and provided a survey to capture some feedback from our operators and stakeholders as well. Scenarios with our operators this month. We had intended to do this before today, but we are waiting on our fiscal year 23 IDEA allocation to be finalized by the department. I've heard that's supposed to come tomorrow, fingers crossed. But what we want the school's IDEA allocation using their current data. Here's what our actual IDEA allocation on the fiscal year 23 funding formula. Here's what it would look like if this new formula were to be would impact them based on the students they are serving. And we will continue collecting feedback since getting these numbers out has taken a little bit longer than anticipated. We're going to extend our feedback window as well. At this point, we have received feedback from 2 of our operators so far. Generally speaking, our operators are anxious to be able to dig in a little deeper with their own data and their own numbers to see how this would impact them if it were to be implemented. Feedback we've received that has varied widely was with regard to our implementation timeline. One of our operators was eager to this because they're a little anxious about TISA coming in and what that'll look like. And another operator asked us if we could just go ahead and start this. Given that variance and the feedback we've received, we feel that this timeline that we're working on still seems like the right timeline, and we still have an opportunity to continue gathering. Please, in terms of next steps, as we will be finalizing our fiscal year 24 IDEA funding methodology, and we will make sure to update our school funding procedures to reflect the new methodology. And then we also will be sending out our preliminary fiscal year 24 entitlement grant allocations to schools once the consolidated funding application process begins later in the spring.
Question. Thank you for this update. It's certain that it'll have more changes as we get closer to implementation, but thank you. All right, we'll move into the next I-22 annual report and monitoring update. Beth Figueroa will now present to where we are on this process.
Richards, and good afternoon. 22 annual report and provide you with an overall performance. So the annual report is required to be produced annually by all authorizers here in the state of Tennessee. Our annual report specifically, we included information about we provided an overall district summary, as we felt it was important to set the context for who are. We also determined that it was going to be important to include within the annual report information of an appellate authorizer, and that looks different than other traditional district authorizers such as Memphis, Shelby County, or MMPS. And we included our strategic plan because this is an essential document that governs and guides our work. Lastly, and what we're going to spend a lot of our time today discussing, is that the annual report is used to summarize the results of each of our schools' academic, financial, and organizational performance, and this is based on the school performance framework. It is reflective of the 21-22 school year. It only includes 4 of our schools. So we know that we are growing. However, the annual report only includes the schools that were open and operating during that time frame. So here is a look of the schools that were included within the annual report, along with some general information about each of the schools. In 21-22, our portfolio was representative of over 1,700 students. And as you are well aware, the Commission's future annual reports will include many, many more schools. So this school year, thank you. This school year, the Commission's portfolio of open schools grew from 4 schools, and it will be growing to 9 schools that are open in 22-23. And we have an additional 5 schools that are currently going through the pre-opening process or will be opening in future years. This context is also important to note as we look at our annual report, because it provides us with an avenue to be very transparent about our school's performance, and it also sets a very clear expectation and standards for what the Commission believes a high-quality public charter school would look like. and whether the schools within our portfolio are demonstrating that clear trajectory of growth year over year. I fully anticipate that as our portfolio grows and becomes more diversified, that the annual report will continue to evolve and change, so that way we have the opportunity to present the information in really meaningful ways. We want our schools to not just, we don't want our annual report just to sit on the shelf. We want our schools to receive the report and really say, wow, I was able to use that for various purposes. So as I transition to discuss each school's performance, I wanted to begin by grounding us in what each rating means. So first we have our exceeds standard. Exceed standards is awarded to schools that are exceeding expectations and showing exemplary performance. This rating is only used in the academic performance portion of the framework, and it only applies to certain substandards. And then schools that meet standards, it means that they are performing within the expectations. And then lastly, as we look at a school that does not meet standards or falls far below, that means that there are significant challenges. And falls far below, we're looking at really there are impacts that significantly impact the viability of the school. So this next slide is just here to provide greater detail regarding each school's performance, and is just a good overall summary of how our schools performed academically, financially, and organizationally. We're now going to talk about the academic performance portion. So the academic portion of the framework is comprised of two key areas, which include student achievement and comparative performance. And the student achievement portion of this section is meant to align with TDOE's accountability model. And the remaining comparative portion is looking at how a school is performing in comparison to the resident district, with the expectation being that they're within 5% of the resident district. We did have to make some adaptations this year, just as a result of not having letter grades, and using kind of the model and the redesign of the new school performance framework. And we did make some changes to the school culture indicators, because in the future those would be included in the organizational section. So here are some academic highlights. I don't want to go line by line, but in general, we already spent a lot of time today talking about Bluff City. Some highlights for them is that they were falling far below as far as their absolute performance in math and ELA. We already talked about their chronic absenteeism rate, and the other thing to note here is just that they were at TBOS 1. Moving on to KIPP Antioch College Prep Elementary and Middle. These schools are performing well academically. They exceeded standards as far as their comparative performance, and the middle school earned a TBOS 5. Nashville Collegiate Prep, they opened in 21-22, so this is their first year of operation, and so we could see here that they do have some challenges academically, as they did not meet standards as far as their TN Ready performance in ELA or math. However, they did meet standards for comparative performance, so when we compared them with MMPS, even though they were technically below, they were within the 5% that we were looking for. Next, moving on to the financial performance, just as a reminder, when we are looking to measure a school's financial performance, we're looking at both their short-term sustainability in like a one-year term, and then what does their long-term sustainability look like as far as their longer-term financial position and viability. So here are the financial highlights that we have here. We've already spent a lot of time talking about Bluff City. So we know that they are in default. That did impact their rating here. They also are experiencing a declining cash position, so that is essentially why they did not meet standards. Looking at KIPP Antioch College Prep schools, they are in very strong financial positions, and we just noted even though their cash is declining, there's a very good story to tell. They're doing significant facility projects, and so really we do not have concerns. And then just at this time, we don't have Nashville Collegiate Prep's audit, so we have not assessed that at this point. And then lastly, we'll just talk about organizational performance. And so when we think about what our organizational portion of our framework includes is it's really thinking of through your compliance related items. How were the schools protecting the rights of students? Were they complying with governance laws, teacher licensures? And so the next slide will talk through the highlights here. And so as you can see, all of the schools met standards in this area. All of them have strengths and they all have areas that they can grow. So for Bluff, it will be continuing to submit their reports on time. For KIPP, we talk a lot about their teacher licensure. That continues to be a challenge. We continue as staff to make them aware of it in each of our quarterly monitoring. And then lastly, just talking through Nashville Collegiate Prep, I just want to speak to the fact that we know that early on in their opening, after they opened, that they did experience some challenges, specifically as it related to compliance with their IEPs, compliance with those students with disability items. However, we have been working closely with them and they have come into full compliance with the requirements. And so essentially they did meet standards on this portion of the framework. With that, I will, any questions?
Any questions? Well, thank you very much. Obviously, there's work to be done, and as we go forward with this, I do think it's good that you're focused on having this report be something that is useful and not just something that goes on a shelf, and I encourage that as a way of moving forward. We will now move on to the renewal process and criteria updates, which will be presented by Maggie Lund.
Hello again. I am going to talk us through renewal process and the proposed criteria that you have in front of you today. So pursuant to statute and our Commission Policy 3.600, charter renewal guidance issued not only by the Commission but the Department of Education, an authorizer shall provide a school with the opportunity to make a clear and compelling case for renewal. We are we've received our first opportunity to go through a renewal process this year. And so I wanted to outline quickly before we kind of talk through next steps, the different pieces that are involved in a renewal process, which you can see here on the slide. The renewal process includes a cumulative performance report, which is provided by the Commission to the applicant that details the performance of the school over the last 9 years. A full application that the school submits to the Commission and to the Department of Education for renewal. We also convene review committees that are made up of both internal and external members to review the renewal applications. We complete a renewal site visit where we visit the school for a full day, and we also will hold a public hearing in the local district as well. All of those things will culminate into an executive director's report with appendices including a review committee report, a site visit report, and the cumulative performance report. You can go to the next slide. So we have Lester Prep, who was an ASD transition school for us last year that is up for renewal this cycle. Also, if authorized, Promise Academy Spring Hill will join this same cycle. So it would be 2 that would go through the renewal process this year if Promise Academy Spring Hill is approved tomorrow. But I also thought this is important to note here as well. I think it's important to discuss our criteria knowing that next year we will be potentially fielding 3 renewals, which include Libertas, Cornerstone Prep, Denver, and if authorized, Lead, Neely's Bend. They will all be up for renewal next year as well. So to speak a little bit about the cumulative performance report, this is in our Commission Policy 3.600. The report summarizes the performance of the school over, its charter term. I want to note it's important to name here that schools that transition to us from the ASD are to carry out the remainder of their charter term under the Commission, in which they would then be up for renewal under the Commission. So we're in a bit of a unique situation here that we are renewing a school that essentially we have not been the authorizer for very long. And in Lester Prep's case, we've been their authorizer since July. So, it is not our data essentially that we're able to pull for this cumulative performance report, but instead we have to pull either publicly available data or data from their previous authorizer, which was the Achievement School District. I want to note here that we established renewal criteria that is in alignment with our school performance framework. And this renewal criteria is a portion of all the different items, as I mentioned in the first slide, that we look at when we are evaluating a renewal. But renewal applicants, as part of the cumulative performance report, receive the criteria along with their data and indicators of whether or not they're on track or off track for renewal in alignment with that criteria. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, Lester Prep is up for renewal as it is their 9th year of their charter agreement. So we have compiled a cumulative performance report for Lester Prep. As a part of this process, we requested all performance reports for Lester Prep for the last 8 years from the ASD. We received 2 reports from the 1920 school year and the 2021 school year. I want to note here that there have been multiple leadership changes and iterations of authorizing at the ASD. There are marked challenges there in terms of historical data. So we did only receive 2 reports. So what we have also done is we have pulled all publicly available data from the data downloads portion of the TDOE website in terms of academic proficiency and growth. We have, kind of outlined this within a pretty large spreadsheet with multiple tabs, and have caveated this for noted gaps of the, 2020 COVID-19 pandemic and lack of state testing, additional state testing issues that took place in 2016, and then when the new state test was issued in 2018, which fundamentally changed proficiency scores across the board. We also, as an extra measure, did go to the operators for Lester Prep and asked for whatever performance reports they were provided over the years, and they were able to provide us some.
That was going to be my question. Did they have a performance report at 5 years that they were given notice on what they were doing well and what they weren't doing well?
We did not have an interim report provided to us by the school.
So this way it's presented, this is another problem with the ASD, correct? I think that ought to be noted, that this is another gap in setting that up that really got me. I mean, the fact that you don't have data like this just says a lot about some of the, what I think are the issues that were there from the beginning with the ASD.
Well, and it's particularly troubling in that this school may not have been given information that it needed in order to correct or improve various areas because they weren't getting the kind of evaluations and updates they should have been getting. Just have to do the best we can with what we've got, but it's unfair to the school too, in a sense.
In the spirit of doing the best that we can with what we've got, I propose this renewal criteria. So I think to address these, unique renewal situations, and I do want to name that this is a unique situation, right? Like, we are basically renewing after only authorizing the school for a very short time. And so we have developed a set of renewal criteria, which we can use in these instances where we have ASD transition schools. And for this year specifically, after the adoption of this criteria, we'll use this criteria for Lester Prep's renewal. If Promise Academy Spring Hill is approved by the commission tomorrow, this renewal criteria will also be used for their renewal. They will be up for immediate renewal. They will have to submit a renewal application in April. So in this case, we have not been their authorizers for any time. But I think due to the timing, it's important to note that we've already issued a cumulative performance report to Lester Prep. That was due to them by January 1, and we sent it to them on December 29th. And we did note to them that the criteria in which we were evaluating them on in this cumulative performance report was in draft form, as you all will be able to adopt it today pending any edits or changes. And then we will provide an updated report to them, to Lester Prep as well, reflecting any of that. And want to note that we will be providing a cumulative performance report to Promise Academy Spring Hill as well, with this criteria and on-track, off-track status. One thing to note too is anything that is deemed off track in this renewal criteria for the schools, they're able to address that in their renewal application that they submit in April, and that can be an ongoing discussion between the review committee and the applicant, as well as brought up during the site visit.
Commissioner Smith, did you have something?
Well, I'm going to regret this. Just as you've been talking and I've been sitting here listening, I think one of the things that would help because this is going to be our first renewal, is really looking at a timeline. And almost on the top is failures of the system, things that were outside of the school's control to think about so we can see that. But then also, where did the school not do things where they did have some access? Because again, we're having to look at things from a lot of different pieces of a lot of different changing landscape over a 10-year period. And then the last thing is, because you're going to give us one more report to read, can we put this on audiobook so that it is that's a joke, but it's I'm just thinking about the sheer amount of things that have happened over the last decade. Some of it within the school's control, some of it outside. I can think about, we had multiple ASD leadership changes, a lot of things going on within the ASD during that time. You have COVID. There is so much to unpack that, it's going to get lost. So I want to make sure we're looking at what was in the school's control, what wasn't, but then how did the school respond to those things that wasn't in its control as we're kind of going through this process.
I appreciate that push, and I think that's really how we approached developing this criteria, was to determine, I think what was in the school's control and outside of the school's control is a discussion, but also what has happened even with like state testing in the last 10 years I think is important to note as well. It's sometimes hard to look at something and discuss clear trajectory when we know that there are noted gaps throughout the course of the last 9 years that are outside of the school's control. I also want to note too, and I think it's important to name as we kind of go into this discussion of, these are turnaround model schools. And so, that progress is not often like in a straight line. Sometimes there are giant leaps forward and small steps back throughout that process. And so I think it's important to have that context here to know that these schools have been doing this work for a while. They earn priority exit to be able to come into the commission's purview. They have made notable gains, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're there yet. And so I want to note as we go through this criteria that not all schools are going to meet the criteria, all the criteria, right? But I think that's okay, and I think that's an opportunity for us to engage, to your point, with the school and determine, what really is in the locus of control of the school, how are they approaching these issues, versus what is sort of external of their control. It's an important thing to keep in mind as we look at renewals.
And even to that point, I would even love to see if the school can provide, and they may not, where they saw that, where it was outside of their control, did they take the initiative to try and address it? It just wasn't addressed above them, because that would really speak to, was the school trying to fix something that they had no control over? Just thinking through their communication, how did it work? And then where were just some of the failures, so that one, hopefully we'll learn from that going forward of, things that we can do to improve so that we don't repeat the past errors.
Absolutely. I agree. So the proposed criteria for, at least academically here, I've kind of got truncated up on the screen for you all, but really what we're looking for is to try to align this as much as possible with our school performance framework, knowing that these schools have not actually been run through our school performance framework, nor do we have the full picture of data that we would be able to fully run them through the school performance framework. So this criteria has been adapted based on publicly available data that we are able to garner, and then evaluate in a way in which we feel like is meaningful to look at a 10-year renewal. So growth, obviously consistent success in TVOS scores. In terms of achievement, we've looked at growth and proficiency for students, but also growth and proficiency for subgroups. We know that that contextualized piece is really important. We also have pieces of comparative performance here, wanting to look at trajectory of closing achievement gaps, not only in comparison to the ASD, right? We want to see them outperform the ASD, but also in terms of their resident district and by subgroup. And then finally, the last piece here is that they've met the criteria for priority exit, which the schools that are in our portfolio have, but really acknowledging that success there, and that they are not currently a priority or focus school. And then in some issues, in some instances, we do have schools that have received quarterly monitoring by us. So we'll take a look at any monitoring we've done with the school for the time that they've been in our portfolio and determine that they've had no significant findings. So the other criteria that we are going to look at in terms of renewal for ASD transition schools that I proposed here are for finance. We'll look at the last 3 years of audits to determine if they would meet standard under the Commission School Performance Framework. And the last 5 years of audits are free from financial statement findings, federal award findings, or question costs. The organizational performance section this is honestly where it gets a little difficult not having previous performance reports from another authorizer, because a lot of this is compliance driven. So what we've proposed here is any past performance reports that we're able to receive from the ASD, we just want to see that there's no ongoing concerns or significant findings organizationally. Similarly, if they've been run through our framework, we would have the same expectation. We also just want to see, I know we've talked a lot about chronic absenteeism. We want to see that there's been an overall reduction in chronic absenteeism across the board, that they've maintained steady enrollment. And one thing we can look at is their governance information and if it's on their website and they're complying with open meetings laws. So again, in the spirit of, I think pressure test is my word for this past time that I've been at the Commission. We have pressure tested everything, as we should. So we have pressure tested this criteria, and you have a pressure test document in the record that you were able to look at and see kind of how it all shook out for each school. As part of the pressure test process, we also engaged with the operator for Lester Prep and asked for their feedback on the criteria as well. The findings from the pressure test that we have kind of already talked about, but I want to reiterate, is that we really do need context in these situations, and I think you all are very well aware of the unique situation that this is. But we have significant testing interruptions over the last 9 years that are outside of the school's control. Also, we know that there are factors that are outside of the school's control in terms of quality data and authorizing practices that they've received over the last 9 years as well. So to try to contextualize this as much as possible, we've included a key within the data that outlines these different interruptions and how it's affected the trajectory of performance. Again, I want to note that not all schools are going to meet all criteria. The criteria is one piece of a very large renewal process, and them receiving an off-track status is something that they will address in their application that they submit. And is something that would be discussed at their site visit and ongoing meetings with the operator through this process. I also want to note, again, and I said it, that this criteria needs to be contextualized for turnaround models. These are not new start situations. And so that's just important to note, too, is that the trajectory is not always a straight line, but we do want to see over the course of the last 9 years significant improvement. So in the spirit of discussion really quickly, I just would love to hear from you all. You know, when we're thinking about these unique renewals, I would love to pose the idea and the question of just, as you're thinking about this, what would you all like to see in terms of what a successful school should be able to prove in terms of earning a 10-year renewal? I want to note that there are no opportunities for like a conditional renewal or a smaller charter term. It is for 10 years. So that is a pretty high stakes renewal. I also want to note that, you know, we're looking at former turnaround models. We have data reliability issues and data availability issues. So noting all those things, I would love to hear from you all as to what you think, you know, you would like to see in the criteria for renewal.
Others who might want to. One of the things that I think we've got to do is recognize this is a situation where we're trying to come up with criteria for 23-24, 1 year. And we're going to learn a lot from this process, and we will probably have different things or change some of the ways we think about this for subsequent years. So we are approving this because I am going to ask for a motion to approve this criteria to bring it before the full commission tomorrow, for this to be the criteria for this 1 year. And understanding that we are where we are, and it is not a perfect world. My biggest concern is that we try to come up with something that makes sense in the context of considering for renewal a school. You've very nicely said it's a turnaround, but the reality of it is the schools that are in that we're going to be considering is probably a school that has been an underperforming school for decades, and they became a part of the ASD and then have been through the ASD process, and now they're going to be given a renewal by us or not given a renewal by us. And that, puts a criteria on, to me, on kind of a harder status, because would we like these schools to be better not only than the ASD schools in their district, but better than the ASD? Yeah, we sure would. And would we like to hold them to higher performance standards on an absolute basis? Yeah. And maybe as we think about this long term, that's where we need to drive the performance to give those children the best possible school option that they can have in that neighborhood. But I'm really got to mind that this is a school that's come from a very troubled background and maybe hasn't had the best administrative situation.
I'm struggling with your first bullet under your first bullet, because to pick up, Chris, on what you said, we are looking at doing something with very incomplete data, and we know as we consider these schools and as we approve them, Richard said, already in a turnaround mode. We felt they had made enough progress that we ought to pick them up. But I really am trying to figure out. I would hate for a signal to be sent that says, okay, you got 10 years, go do whatever. Let me just sort of say it. I think we know that we have this renewal for 10 years, but how do we make sure that there's an understanding? Got to be continued progress. This isn't just a carte blanche. All the heat, all the pressure's off. Just keep doing what you're doing. But you're here. I want you to be successful, because if you are, that means children have had a good option. But this is not the time to say, okay, we've got a 10-year window again. Like, unfortunately, I think it's part of what happened at ASD. Is there'll be anomalies. We got to show. That's the biggest. I think it's your point too. Not like a big sigh being expressed if they get to 10 years. It's about. I think you're in a position where you ought to continue. At the same time, there are real measure points.
I agree. And I think the criteria that we've set up, looks very holistically at the school, and we're able to have, those discussions in a meaningful way throughout the renewal process. And while this renewal is for 10 years, I also want to note that this doesn't stop the commission if they feel moved to place them on any sort of corrective action post-renewal. And so I think that that's important to note here, too, is that if we do feel like there are, as a body, if there are significant gaps that still exist that you, as a commission, would like staff to have more close oversight of, that is an option post-renewal that could happen.
Chris Kessler, but at the same time, I don't want them to feel like we're penalizing them because they were an ASD school. I think there's a real balance made to what you just talked about. is, in making sure coming out, we want them to be successful. And so we're not starting them off at a different level because of how they got to us. But at the same time, we recognize there may be challenges that that's the best I can say.
I add one thing. We need to be mindful there when they were celebrating their priority status and being released from the ASD. There is a certain part of these schools that we have taken that they really do feel like they have accomplished a tremendous amount. And with the lack of data, we're certainly not in a position to say that they haven't compared to where they were. We'll have to kind of guess about some of it. But it is also apparent there is a tremendous amount of work to be done in every single one of these schools. And I think that's going to be the trick. And maybe we can use the 5-year review as a, something that we can point at and say, look, yes, you're renewed, but when you need to keep in mind that when you get to your 5-year review, we're going to be looking for additional improvement in, these our performance framework. And the good thing about having the performance framework worked out is that we're telling them what they've got to do to succeed as far as our standards. And I think one of the things these schools have struggled with is knowing what they were working against, because it has moved around a lot on them.
So all of my friends at the DOE, now is the time to mute your computer so you don't hear some of this. One of the things that I know that is out there that we might want to see if it's possible to start looking at, they do STAR testing, 3 times a year, benchmark testing, some data that we could look at by cohorts. There's going to be a difference between an elementary school that has these kids from beginning of their educational versus ones that may be coming from a school going into middle school or high school. So I think we're going to have to kind of look at this a little differently. And I know my friends at the DOE would say, well, those have not been going through my favorite word, the psychometricians. I don't really care about that right this minute. I want to know, how are cohorts doing year over year over year? Because regardless of all those interruptions, we should at least be able to see, were these students making the type of progress we were anticipating? So again, yes, historically they were failing schools, but in this 10 years, how did the students, when they had them, how did the students perform compared to that student's past performance? Not compared to the 10 years of students before them, but to that student's past performance. So it's going to take a little bit more work as we're looking at this, and it's something that, because of all the disruptions, I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging for us to do. But there is some data points out there that I think we need to try and get our hands on, so that we're looking at cohort to cohort, that we're not looking at 10 years ago to now. I want to see student group to student group. How is the school moving over this 10-year journey that may not be necessarily able to be reflected in some of that other stuff, that might be absent of some of those outliers? How is the school doing? When it comes to middle school, high school, again, I would love to see, just picking let's just assume for a second, assume you have middle school or elementary school A, B, and C feeding into middle school. Well, how were cohorts coming out of that? And then as the school was working backwards to address things, how did those cohorts continue to advance once they left? Again, you could have an 80% and 80% and a 40%, and it's going to lower the overall percentage. But we should be looking at the schools that were working with this, that were the feeder schools. How did those students perform? Because were we still moving those students forward? So that's just kind of where my mind is going right now as I've been listening to you. It gets a little more granular in the data as we're looking at this, so that, because it's really, is the school now achieving something better than they were when this all first started? Where we were at in the middle, which was a lot of the ASD turmoil around 2015, 16, some of the testing issues around 15, 16, 17, and all of that. And then we have the pandemic. So it kind of strips some of that away, where we can kind of look at student groups. based on some of that benchmark testing. So that's just where my mind was going, just to kind of be able to give us a little clearer understanding. Again, it's not going to be perfect. I just want to know that the school is truly indeed doing what we want it to do before we give them another 10-year lease on life. Because if not, at the end of the day, I have to sit here and go, is this the right operator for what we're trying to accomplish?
Other comments or discussion?
I think, Chair Richards, one particular question that I actually want to hear from you all is, so specifically Lester Prep exited the priority school list, achieved priority exit status, came to us, and then based on last year's data was placed back on the priority school list. So there will be a new list run in the fall before you all have to consider a renewal. And I think we would like to hear is, don't want to be black and white, but if a school is currently on the priority school list, given the track record and all the things we've talked about, how much should we consider that in making a recommendation, right? Is that a kind of an automatic no? Would you want considerations? I just want us to be I think that is a reality that they may be up on the priority school list again in the fall.
Well, and that's why I want to get down to that more granular level, because the school, to get on the priority list, they take all schools, do this entire mathematical, and then which ones fall into the bottom 5%. Well, it doesn't mean the school went backwards. It may have slowed in growth, and someone else, a couple other schools, were speeding up, which by mathematical caused them to fall back on the list. It's not anything that the school was doing wrong. So that's why I want to look more at that data, because, again, when they run it, it's based off of a formula that DOE comes up with which schools are now in the bottom 5%. It doesn't, well, I guess priority list is the bottom 15%, and then you've got your, bottom 5% and all that stuff. I want to make sure that we're taking some of that into account, because if you all came back and said, I'm just going to pick on Lester Prep, the early data said this, the middle data showed that they were growing, but then they went backwards. Okay, that would be a different story versus they went forward, they were still moving forward, but at a slower rate, because XYZ, we had 3 more schools come into the list that were growing at that early fast rate, which knocked them back down. Does that make sense?
Well, one thing that I liked about this criteria was it didn't set a line in the sand on any of the criteria components. And it's one reason why I felt comfortable bringing this to the whole commission, because there isn't a single one thing that can knock the school out of eligibility for renewal. It's a holistic approach to the question that we have with respect to an individual school. And I felt comfortable with that, to answer your question. I mean, I'm not seeing it as if they go back in priority status again, that knocks them out. I think we have to look at it, and that's part of your context conversation as well, as to how this works, compared to the other schools. Are they just not growing, improving as much, or wherever we are? This, to me, is the hardest thing. I mean, I know school performance and accountability we've worked on forever. We were not planning to have renewal conversations in the context that we're getting them, because we're getting schools out of the ASD that are at the end of their charter term and have to either be renewed or discontinued. And so we're ending up having to do this much earlier than we had thought. We thought we would have information based on our performance criteria and our understanding of the schools, and because of the way they're coming out, some of these, one of them, we're not even going to have a year's worth of data from what I can tell. So I'm okay with this criteria and bring it to the commission as a whole for approval, in part because I think the flexibility that's built into the various sections gives us the ability to do the right thing. And that's the most important thing, is to do the right thing for the kids and the school. And we all wish it was different. We all wish it was much more, by the book. But we've got to deal with what we've got to deal with. Mr. Carter?
Madam Chair, so let me preface my statements preface my opening by saying that, as a new commissioner who truly doesn't have a real issues. And really haven't. Comments would be one of just kind of a observation. That is that just like in terms of SAT scores or LSAT scores, in some instances they have been criteria that have been established to exclude people from having access. And so the thing that I look at is that, and I think anybody who's in fact is maybe evaluating whether someone has the right wherewithal to succeed, going to law school or getting in college, is those intangibles. Because leadership's everything. So, you know, me just looking at data, and again, I'm going to preface by saying again, the neophyte here, again, will always ask the question about, tell me about who in fact's leading. Tell me about those intangibles. I see the data, and sometimes it's real black and white. I mean, truly, if the data is so skewed that, again, we just haven't seen any degree of performance, but if it's a straight line, but they, in fact, again, are not meeting the criteria for continuing a relationship, I then say, tell me about who's leading. And tell me about, in fact, what they've tried to do. That's an intangible that's not data-driven in terms of before you ask me to make a decision. So as I roll my sleeves up and I, in fact, look at trying to get a better sense of, again, the schools that are under our jurisdiction and wanting to get to know the personnel, I think I'll be looking to staff to one-on-one, or, you know, I'll go visit. That's going to weigh in my decision in terms of how I, in fact, can form an opinion. Form an opinion that really is going to be weighted on, again, facts, but it's going to be one that, in fact, is just not going to be data-driven. So I hope that resonates. I hope that really does make sense. Today, you know, when we look at the fact that we have a challenging situation, so for someone who is a co-founder of a charter school, we knew what we were signing up for when we started this at my charter school in Detroit, that these ninth graders, high school students, were 3 and 4 grades behind where they should have been. And it's still a challenge after 10 years of being in operation. And we have put the time in. We put resources in, and it's still a challenge. I'm a business guy. So again, I've had to put my listening ears on to really understand the challenge that again, school leaders, teachers have in terms of trying to move not 50 basis points, but move 15 basis points. Don't talk about a whole grade, but I'm talking about basis points. So again, tell me about the personnel. Tell me, in fact, again, who's leading that particular school, along with, again, the data, so that, in fact, we can, I get up to speed and I know where the restrooms are, and so then I can really make a decision, because truly, at this juncture, I can't weigh in a commentary that I just, more than just data.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this criteria allows us to develop that insight and allows us to consider those kinds of things. And this is going to be a 1-year, you know, process we will go through. We will come to the end of it and probably conclude that there are things we want to change about the criteria for the next year, and probably conclude that there are some things we did really well. But we've got this problem. I think the flexibility that's built into this, and I commend the staff for what they've done, because they've put a lot of work and thought into this. We've got flexibility. It's got all the pieces. It will give us a chance to explore all those aspects of there'll be Lester Prep and schools that will follow, and we'll see where we are in renewal. I think it also gives us an opportunity to build into as we go through the process, the clear expectations of what we're going to do if they are renewed. And, you know, one of the things I always have found, that if you have to deal with a situation that's a problem, the one thing you can take accountability for is the things you put in place. And as a commission, I think we need to look at this process from that framework. Are we putting in place a way of considering renewals that will allow us to fairly treat the renewal in and of itself, but also, if we grant the renewal, move forward in a way that really gives these schools an opportunity? And I'm comfortable with these criteria, so I'll leave it at that. Mr.
Well,
Eddie?
and I want to go back because Chair Griscom, from now on, make sure I speak before Commissioner Carter because he makes me a whole lot better. When he explained it, he articulated it so much better than what I was doing a second ago. When he said that he's looking at who's leading the school, that's why I wanted to know when all of these challenges were going on, how were they responding to it? Because that tells me it's those intangibles. He said it a whole lot better than I did. That's what I was trying to get at. So from now on, I'm going to throw out my ideas and then let Commissioner Carter interpret those so that you all understand what it is that I'm saying.
Okay. Other comments or discussion? Okay, if not, is there a motion to approve the renewal criteria and recommend it to the full commission?
We'll make that motion.
Seconded.
Regine, would you like to read the roll?
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Tudor?
Aye.
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Thank everyone for your thoughtful consideration of this. And staff, we really do appreciate your approach to this. And I know, Tess, you've provided leadership on this as well, because this is a tough one. Now we're going to move into the Charter Commission School Performance Framework Policy on Final Reading. We can move through this pretty quickly because a lot of it is a repetition of what we basically went through and approved in October, but we held out the one section of it because we needed more insight as to what the state was going to require. So with that, I will turn it over to Maggie to walk us through this, with the goal being that we can put a final approval to recommend it to the commission at the end of our conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Richards. I will make this quick because I think you've heard me talk about school performance framework for a very long time. As just a reminder, we began this process in March. This has been a robust process, and so what's in front of you today is for final read, and our schools will be held accountable to this immediately. So we, in the October meeting, we brought the majority of the framework to you all for final read, minus section 1A, which was a student outcome section that directly aligns to the state's accountability model due to some fluctuations that were happening with that accountability model and the lack of issuance of letter grades for the last year. We wanted to just pause and make sure that we fully understood what was coming down the pipeline in terms of accountability before we put anything in front of you all for final read. So I just want to note that this section has been updated. You received the redline document as to what those updates are. The updates are basically just to ensure that it's flexible, yet it is aligned to the state accountability model. And we also incorporated a concrete contingency plan within the section should there be a pause of issuance of letter grades or any other major changes ongoing. So just a high-level changes within the redline document. You'll see that there's the removal of specific components of the letter grade calculation. We used to have all the details that went into the letter grade calculation because of fluctuations that happened with the accountability protocol. We removed those and we just updated the language to specify that we would directly align to the accountability protocol and the framework. That way, should any changes be made, we won't have to bring the framework back up for edits every single time. Also, there is a contingency plan in there, as I mentioned, and if you go to the next slide, I can talk through that. Basically, what that contingency plan is that if the letter grades are not issued or paused for any reason, we will hold schools accountable to their ELPA data and their chronic absenteeism rate at 10% for that section, and then we'll reallocate that weight to the other sections of the framework. The reason we're comfortable doing that and proposing this is The other sections of the framework are based on indicators that are part of that letter grade calculation. So the comparative performance is looking at achievement on TN Ready. And then we also have the TVOS indicator as a significant portion of our framework as well. So we feel comfortable just reallocating those sections to the other sections of the framework should there be a pause of issuance. But just wanted to note that the ELPA data and the chronic absenteeism are not other parts of the academic section, which is why we've held them in that same place as a contingency. I also want to note we've been working with our schools really closely on their mission-specific goals. You guys received a one-pager that has all of like a synopsis of those mission-specific goals. That's been a really great process, and our schools are excited about being able to be held accountable to something that is directly aligned to their mission. And so those are all updated within the appendix, which is the school performance framework of their charter agreement as well. And I just want to say thank you. For all of your collaboration and hard work in this process. I will take questions.
I'm glad to make a motion to approve the framework.
Thank you.
Seconded.
All right. Is there any further discussion? I just want to say thank you. This work has been just incredibly time-consuming and difficult, and we really appreciate it. I think we've ended up in a really good spot. I'd like to call the roll, please.
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Tudor?
Aye.
Commissioner Griscom?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
All right, the last item on our agenda is a presentation on the Rutherford Collegiate Prep petition. Beth, I'm going to recognize you to provide this update.
Thank you, Chair Richards. And to respect everybody's time, I will do my best to work through this recommendation as timely as possible. But I also want to name just that this was it was a complex amendment petition to work through, and it required a lot of due diligence on staff's part. There's a lot of moving pieces, and so I will do my best to work through this and explain it in detail. But again, honoring everybody's time. And so where we're at today with this amendment petition, I'm really happy with where we've landed. It's really important that we balance the need that the operator has to be flexible should they find a facility space that meets their needs. But it's also important that as a commission we have the parameters and the oversight that we need in order to assist and support that school as they start opening their operations. And so to begin, I want to first just contextualize the conversation today with some key background information that's very relevant and necessary as we kind of walk through this recommendation and the amendment petition in detail. And so the amendment petition for Rutherford Collegiate Prep is to open in the 23-24 school year, serving grades kindergarten through second grade and a total enrollment of 250 students. And so Rutherford Collegiate Prep, or you might hear me say RCP, they are governed by Rethink Forward, and this school was approved by the Commission in January of 2022 with the intent that they would open that same fall, the fall of 2022. And their goal was to open serving kindergarten through fifth grade and then scale year over year till they eventually met their goal of kindergarten through 8 or 770 students. In addition to RCP, the Commission also authorizes Nashville Collegiate Prep, which we talked about earlier today, which is also operated by Rethink Forward. And Nashville Collegiate Prep, they're in their second year of operations, and they serve roughly 400 students in the southeast region of Davidson County. Both schools have contracted with Noble Education Initiative, and they serve as the charter school's charter management organization. So since the Commission's initial approval, RCP has faced extraordinary facility challenges in finding just a space and a site that's suitable for them. Whether it be a short-term facility solution or a long-term facility solution, it has been extraordinarily challenging. So with that, they did push their opening year from fall of 2022 to the 23-24 school year, and it's their goal to open as they intended. It's also worth noting here that there are real facility challenges that exist within Rutherford County. No charter school operators is immune to this. We're going to see this in future amendments or future New Start petitions. And I would also say that even the school district is not immune from these challenges. We've been working really closely and collaborating with the district, and I'm so thankful that they have been so collaborative to help us understand the challenges with school zones, with annexation that's required in order to tap into sewers. And then for charter schools specifically, within Rutherford County, there's actually 2 school districts. There's Rutherford City Schools, or Rutherford County Schools, and there's Murfreesboro City Schools. So all of these items make this all the more challenging to charter school operators as they look to open within Rutherford County. And so with this being said, RCP has been looking for a facility since the spring of 2022. And I would say that we really appreciate they've been very collaborative with us, and they've kept us well informed. And they've gone through many potential sites, many potential leads, and unfortunately none of them up until this point have come to fruition. And so in their efforts to create that needed flexibility, that's why they are proposing to reduce the number of grades served as well as the number of students, because it provides them that opportunity to have greater flexibility as they're looking for a facility, because something smaller would be much more possible. So as we know, these plans, they continue to change and evolve for schools as they're in those pre-opening process of looking for a site. And at this point, they have, since the filing of this amendment petition, they have identified both a promising short-term facility option, and they have executed a purchase and sale agreement on an 8-acre parcel of land, and they intend to build their long-term facility there. So there is significant momentum that the school has made since the filing of this amendment petition. And so just in talking about the short-term facility, they intend to locate there for 1 year, and they would locate there while that permanent facility is being built on that property that they're in the process of purchasing. And the temporary facility, it's a church, and it's located 2 miles from their long-term facility. And this is a very promising movement for the school, but there are a few things that we have to work through. And the first item is that they are not able to enter into a lease agreement until the congregation votes on that and they accept and approve the school operating on their church campus. And then additionally, the site is only conducive to serving kindergarten through 1st grade and 106 students. So we have a plan, we have an amendment petition, and we kind of have to reconcile those 2 items. So the contingency plan for RCP at this time is, should the congregational vote fail, they would need to go back to the drawing board and continue to look for temporary facilities. So because we do not know at this time whether the school will be able to move forward and finalize their current lease agreement, and we also know that this temporary site cannot accommodate the 250 students that is within this amendment petition, we are recommending and including within the recommendation that we include additional language within the amended charter petition, or their charter agreement, to kind of address these items. So the language that we are proposing be included within their amended charter agreement would say that RCP, if they are approved, they are able to enroll students in grades no higher than the amendment petition. So you can enroll up to K through 2. However, if your site is approved and it's K1, that would be allowable. Additionally, just given this challenging facility market, and in an effort to be partners with them, that it would allow them to open, but with a smaller grade band as well as a smaller enrollment total. So instead of 250, the 106, would be acceptable. And then moreover, the language would include the RCP would be required to be under some sort of temporary lease agreement by March 1st. Otherwise, they do need to delay. So that puts that kind of stopgap in there. So in short, this creates that flexibility that they need should that smaller site materialize, but also puts the commission in a better position because now we have that language within the amended charter agreement. I now want to transition to talk about the long-term facility plan for RCP, because that's also an important factor in this. So as I previously stated, they are in the process of purchasing an 8-acre parcel of land, And on this property, that's where they would construct their new building that would include all the things that we think of with Rethink Forward. They have their open classroom spaces, multi-purpose room, gym. It's really what they were most excited about in the first place when they filed their initial application, was to start fresh and start from the ground up in Rutherford County. So it really meets that need. And so while I would say that we are encouraged by the operator's ability to secure land, and they've provided that timeline, there will be continued challenges that the school is going to have to face. So as I previously mentioned, they have to go through the annexation process to tap into sewer. They have to go through zoning changes and environmental studies. So we have a lot of promise here, but we also have to, I want to make sure we're naming the challenges that they have ahead of them. As is the case with any facility project, it is key for the operator to have strong contingency plans should they need to pivot quickly. And at this time, if they run into delays and they need to be in that temporary facility for longer than 1 year, they stated that they would engage with the church or continue to look for an additional temporary site. So overall, I would say that the operator has made substantial progress towards opening in the 2023-24 school year. And the submitted amendment petition does outline short-term, and we have a long-term facility plan that allows them to serve the students of Rutherford County. Additionally, just in the spirit of transparency and collaboration, and through working with Rutherford Collegiate Prep and Rutherford County School, I would say that Commission staff has gained a much better understanding of the real challenges that exist within Rutherford County. And I think that I would say that we are in a place to approach our authorizing work in the best posture to see the school open successfully in the future. So with this recommendation, as I mentioned, there are strict boundaries and oversight that we would include, just recognizing the challenges that are still to come. So based on the totality of the record, it is the recommendation to approve Rutherford Collegiate Prep amendment and move it to the full commission for consideration, as it does provide that real opportunity for the operator to move forward as they intend to serve the students of the community. However, within that amended charter agreement, there would be that additional language. So the first item would be that Rutherford Collegiate Prep would be required to go through the pre-opening process, not only in that temporary facility site, but similar to what we've done with Nashville Collegiate Prep, they would go through a subsequent facility-specific pre-opening process. Additionally, as we mentioned, the amendment petition that was filed was for K2 and a total enrollment of 250 students, but we would allow them to open with a smaller grade band or smaller number of students, should they be able to move forward on a temporary facility that accommodates a smaller amount. They would be required to be under a lease agreement on a temporary site no later than March 1st, 2023. Otherwise, it is the understanding that they will have to delay an additional year. And then lastly, that should the charter school be required to operate from a temporary location beyond the 23-24 school year, so construction delays, issues with annexation, that the authorizer would determine whether or not that change is material to the charter agreement. We have worked with the charter school operator. They have reviewed these items, and they are signed off and in agreement with the terms and sessions. I'm happy to take them.
I just have one, and then I promise I'm shutting up. So construction delays are a real possibility. If we get to the point where they do need to look at an additional year, would they have to come back before us to get permission? Because I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I'd rather go ahead and just authorize them for 2 years in this one place. If they have to change locations, then come back. But let's just speed this up. Because if we're going to approve them in this one place for 1 year, 2 years doesn't, obviously contingent upon the church approving, but they don't have to come back to us, and the church isn't waiting on us meeting before they can start moving forward if they say there's going to be significant delays. That's my only thought.
Yes, absolutely. I will speak to point 4, and then I will have our general counsel speak up and fill in any gaps that I leave. And so essentially we are stating within the amended agreement that they would notify us if they need to continue in that location. And then the authorizer, we would determine whether or not that changes material. So if they're staying in the church, this is just an example. Like if they're staying in the church, maybe we say, that's not material, you're just gonna continue there. But if they're like, we have to find a whole new facility altogether and it's gonna be in this different region, that would be a very different scenario. I'm not sure if Ashley has other items to add.
Beth explained that correctly. The language of the charter agreement has them report out to us. We determine if it's material. If it's material, we bring it back to the commission.
Any other comments or questions?
Can I try to give you a motion?
Yes, sir.
Because I took notes. We'll see if I did. You can tell me whether I did well or not. The motion would be to approve the RCP petition with these provisions. That they're required to go through all pre-opening processes, that we're approving K-2 with 250 students, but allow a smaller grade band if necessary, but they will come back and share that with staff. I've just added that in. 3, that they need to have a lease agreement in place by March 1, 2023. And then finally, if they have to operate in a temporary facility beyond 2023, the authorizer will determine whether that's a material agreement. Did I get them right? Okay. So with that's what I would say is the motion, Madam Chair.
Do I have a second?
Seconded.
He's got notes. He's got notes. I saw him over here. He was working away at it. All right. Regine, would you like to call the roll, please?
Commissioner Richards?
Aye.
Commissioner Tudor?
Aye.
Commissioner Griscom?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Okay. I want to say thank you for your attendance and participation in this meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. Are there any final comments? If not, will someone make a motion to adjourn? You're not on the committee.
I make the motion to adjourn.
I'll second it.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, thank you all.
Chris, I would have given that last. I know.
Through RCP. You will get to know RCP. You will get to know Noble Education Initiative. They're just, everything's just wonderful and then it falls backwards.
It's not always wonderful.
But they did get kind of hosed on Rutherford County because they were told